The dust-choked street of Willow Creek, Nevada seemed to shimmer like a mirage as Willa Callaghan stumbled from the stagecoach, her once fine dress now travel-worn and faded. She clutched a small valise containing everything she owned in the world, which wasn't much after her father's death, had left her with nothing but debts and desperate hopes of a teaching position that awaited her in this frontier town. The year was 1875, and the West was still wild enough to be dangerous but settled enough that a town like Willow Creek had pretensions of civilization, a church, a schoolhouse, and most importantly to Willa at that moment, a hotel where she could wash away the dust of travel before presenting herself to the town council. "Room for the night," she said to the stern-faced woman behind the counter of the Willow Creek Hotel. "The cheapest you have available, please." Mrs. Holcomb, the proprietress, looked her up and down with practiced suspicion. "That'll be $1.50 up front." Willa's heart sank as she opened her coin purse. The stagecoach journey had cost more than expected after an axle break required passengers to pay extra for replacement transportation. She counted her remaining coins, just 87 cents. I seem to be short," she stammered, cheeks burning with embarrassment. "Perhaps I could pay the remainder tomorrow. I'm to meet with the town council about the teaching position. Mrs. Holcomb's thin lips curved into something resembling a smile. "Oh, my dear, I'm afraid you've had a wasted journey. The council hired a teacher from Sacramento 2 weeks ago." The room seemed to tilt beneath Willa's feet. "There must be some mistake. I received a letter. Board must have sent letters to several candidates before deciding, Mrs. Holcomb said without sympathy. "Now about that room, please," Willa whispered. "I have nowhere else to go. Could I perhaps work to pay?" A harsh laugh erupted from the corner of the lobby where 2 well-dressed men sat smoking cigars. "Another charity case wanting credit," one of them drawled loudly enough for everyone to hear. The second man joined in. "Poor Mrs. Holcomb would go bankrupt if she let every pretty face with a sad story stay for free." Willa's face burned hotter, but she kept her spine straight as more patrons in the lobby began to chuckle at her predicament. "I don't run a charity, miss," Mrs. Holcomb said firmly. "If you can't pay, you can't stay." The laughter grew as Willa gathered what dignity she could muster. She had nowhere to go, no money for a return journey, and night was falling in an unfamiliar town. "That's enough." The deep voice cut through the laughter like a knife. Willa turned to see a tall man in dust-covered clothes approaching the counter. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could make out sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. He wasn't dressed like the other men in the lobby, no fancy vests or polished boots. His clothes were practical, worn in a way that spoke of honest work rather than poverty. "How much does she owe?" he asked Mrs. Holcomb. "This isn't your concern, York," Mrs. Holcomb replied with a sniff. "How much?" he repeated, more firmly this time. $1.50. Without hesitation, the man York reached into his pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. He counted out $2 and placed them on the counter with a deliberate motion that silenced the room. "Keep the extra, for her breakfast in the morning." He turned to Willa, tipping his hat slightly. "Madam." Before she could thank him, he strode out of the hotel, spurs jingling softly with each step. The door swung shut behind him, leaving Willa staring after him in stunned silence. "Well," Mrs. Holcomb said, sweeping the coins into her hand. "Room 4, up the stairs and to the left. You're paid through breakfast." As Willa climbed the narrow staircase, she wondered about the man who had saved her from humiliation, and possibly a night spent sleeping on a bench. York. No last name offered, just a kindness from a stranger that had cost him more than she could repay. She vowed to find him tomorrow and thank him properly. even as she wondered what she would do after breakfast, with no job prospects and no money in a town where she knew no one. Willa rose before dawn, too restless to sleep. She washed her face in the basin of cold water, pinned her chestnut hair into a simple but neat arrangement, and donned her second-best dress, saving her best for whatever opportunity might present itself. The dress was a faded blue cotton, modest and practical, but the color at least complemented her eyes. The hotel dining room was nearly empty at this early hour. Willa quietly consumed the simple breakfast of biscuits, gravy, and coffee that her mysterious benefactor had paid for. Each bite reminded her of her precarious situation, but she forced herself to eat. She would need her strength. As she was finishing, Mrs. Holcomb approached her table. "You'll be checking out after breakfast," she said, not unkindly but firmly, "unless you've found means to extend your stay." "I understand," Willa replied. "Thank you for the room and meal." She hesitated, then asked, "The gentleman who helped me last night, York, might you know where I could find him to thank him?" Mrs. Holcomb's expression softened slightly. "York Alderman. He's got a ranch about 5 miles north of town, but he rarely comes to town except for supplies once a month. You're lucky he was here yesterday." Willa thanked her for the information. 5 miles was a long walk, but what choice did she have? She had to thank him, and perhaps he might know of work she could find. The thought of begging for employment from a stranger made her stomach twist, but pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. Outside, Willow Creek was coming to life. Merchants opened their stores, a wagon loaded with lumber creaked down the street, and 2 young boys chased a barking dog past the hotel. Willa stood on the boardwalk, clutching her valise, trying to decide her next move when a familiar voice spoke behind her. "Miss Callaghan." She turned to find York Alderman standing there, looking even taller in the morning light. Without the shadow of his hat, she could see his face clearly, strong jawline, straight nose, and those remarkable gray eyes that seemed to see right through her. His dark hair was cut short, practical rather than fashionable. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, but there was something compelling about his face character, perhaps etched by sun and hard work. "Mr. Alderman," she said, surprised, "I was just asking about you. I wanted to thank you for your kindness last night." He shifted uncomfortably, as if unused to gratitude. "No need for thanks. Nevertheless, you have mine. I intend to repay you as soon as I'm able." A flicker of a smile crossed his face. "That why you're carrying your bag?" "Planning to walk to my ranch to work off the debt." Willa felt heat rise in her cheeks. No, I simply have nowhere else to go at the moment." She straightened her shoulders. "The teaching position I came for has already been filled." York studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Got family back east you can return to?" "No," she said simply. "My father passed last winter. There's nothing to go back to." He nodded as if her answer confirmed something for him. "I might have work for you if you're interested." Hope surged in Willa's chest, quickly tempered by caution. A woman alone had to be careful of offers from men, even ones who seemed decent. "What kind of work?" "Housekeeper. Cook. My last one quit 2 months ago to marry a shopkeeper in Carson City." He gestured down the street to where a wagon stood laden with supplies. "I'm heading back to the ranch now." "You're welcome to the position if you want it. Pays fair room, board, and $15 a month." It wasn't teaching, but it was honest work with a roof over her head, and $15 a month would allow her to save enough to perhaps try another town in a few months. "May I ask how many people I would be cooking for?" "Just me, mostly. Hired hands take meals in the bunkhouse most days, cook for themselves. Big ranch dinner on Sundays, though, for everyone." Willa considered her options, which were admittedly few. "I accept your offer, Mr. Alderman, with gratitude, but I insist my first wages go toward repaying what I owe you." Another almost smile. "Suit yourself. Wagon's leaving in 10 minutes." As she climbed onto the wagon seat beside him, Willa wondered if she was making a terrible mistake. But the alternative was worse destitution in a strange town without friends or prospects. And there was something about York Alderman that inspired trust, despite his reserved manner. Perhaps it was the way he had quietly helped her without making a spectacle of it. Or perhaps it was simply that she had no choice but to trust someone, and he had been kind when others were cruel. The wagon rolled out of town, and Willa Callaghan left behind the life she had planned, and faced the unknown future that lay ahead on a ranch 5 miles north with a taciturn cowboy who had placed his savings on a counter for a woman he'd never met. The journey to the Alderman ranch passed mostly in silence. York wasn't one for idle conversation, and Willa was too preoccupied with the sudden change in her circumstances to make small talk. The landscape around them was beautiful in its stark way, rolling hills, dotted with sagebrush, and the distant purple smudge of mountains on the horizon. Spring had brought a flush of green to the land, but Willa knew from what little she'd read about Nevada that the green wouldn't last long once summer arrived. "Your ranch," she ventured after nearly an hour of silence. "What do you raise?" "Cattle mostly. Some horses." He glanced at her. "Ever lived on a ranch before?" "No. I grew up in St. Louis. My father was a bookkeeper." York nodded. "Ranch life is different, harder in some ways, simpler in others." "I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Alderman." "York," he corrected. "Everyone calls me York out here." "Then I'm Willa," she replied, surprising herself with the informality. But if she was to live and work on his ranch, perhaps first names were appropriate. As they crested a small rise, the Alderman ranch came into view. It was larger than Willa had expected, a substantial main house built of timber and stone, a large barn, several outbuildings, and a bunkhouse set a short distance away. A corral near the barn held several horses, and in the distance, she could see cattle grazing on the spring grass. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. York's expression softened as he looked at his property. "Built most of it myself. Started with just the cabin, that small building there behind the main house. Used to be all there was." It was the most he'd said at once, and Willa sensed his pride in what he'd accomplished. "How long have you been here?" 10 years. Came out after the war with what I'd saved from army pay. Land was cheap then." Willa did the calculation in her head. If he'd been in the Union Army and was perhaps 20 when he enlisted, that would make him about 35 now. Not much older than her 23 years, but the difference seemed greater. He had the weathered look of a man who had seen much of life's hardships. As they approached the house, a dog came bounding out to meet them, a large, shaggy beast of indeterminate breeding that barked enthusiastically. "That's Rusty," York said. "He's friendly." Rusty proved this by immediately jumping up to greet Willa as she descended from the wagon, nearly knocking her over in his enthusiasm. She laughed, steadying herself against the wagon while patting the dog's head. "Down, Rusty," York commanded, and the dog immediately dropped to all fours, though his tail continued to wag furiously. A young man emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "Boss, wasn't expecting you back so soon." "Changed my plans, Pete. This is Miss Callaghan. She'll be taking over as housekeeper." Pete tipped his hat to Willa. He couldn't have been more than 20, with a shock of red hair and a face full of freckles. "Madam, pleased to meet you. Pete Simmons is my foreman," York explained. "He keeps things running when I'm away." "I'll show her around if you want, boss," Pete offered with an eager smile that suggested he wouldn't mind spending time with the new housekeeper. "I'll handle it," York replied, his tone neutral but firm. Would you unload the supplies and see to the horses?" "Yes, sir." York led Willa toward the main house. It was impressive up close, 2 stories with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Inside, the house was clean but Spartan, with functional furniture and few decorative touches. The main floor consisted of a large kitchen with an adjoining dining room, a parlor, and what appeared to be York's office. Upstairs were several bedrooms. "You'll have this room," York said, opening a door to a pleasant chamber at the back of the house. It was simply furnished with a bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a small desk beneath a window that overlooked a kitchen garden and the mountains beyond. "It's lovely," Willa said, meaning it. After weeks of uncertainty following her father's death, and the humiliation of the previous evening, having a room of her own in this peaceful place felt like an unexpected gift. Bathrooms down the hall got indoor plumbing put in last year. "Pump in the kitchen too, so you won't have to haul water from the well." He showed her the rest of the house, ending in the kitchen. "I keep things simple. Breakfast at sunrise, supper at sunset. Lunch depends on where I'm working that day. Might come in, might not. And my duties." Willa asked, removing her bonnet and setting it on the kitchen table. If this was to be her domain, she might as well get comfortable. "Cooking, cleaning, laundry. House isn't that big, but it gets dusty. Sunday dinners for the hands, usually about 8 men altogether. Might need help in the garden sometimes too. Previous housekeeper, Mrs. Donovan, kept a vegetable patch out back." Willa nodded, taking mental notes. "And when do you expect me to start?" York glanced out the window at the setting sun. "Tomorrow's soon enough. You've had a long day." "I'm not tired," she insisted. "I could prepare supper at least." He studied her face, then nodded. "Pantry's stocked. Whatever you find is fine." After York left to help Pete with the supplies, Willa explored the kitchen. It was well equipped with a large cast iron stove, ample counter space, and a pantry full of staples: flour, sugar, coffee, beans, and canned goods. She found bacon, potatoes, and onions, and decided on a simple but hearty meal. By the time York returned, she had bacon frying, potatoes and onions sizzling in the rendered fat, and a pot of coffee brewing. The kitchen was warm and fragrant, and for the first time since her father's death, Willa felt a sense of purpose. "Smells good," York said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door and washing his hands at the pump. "It's nothing fancy," Willa replied, "but it's hot and there's plenty of it." They ate at the kitchen table rather than in the dining room. The meal was simple but satisfying, and York seemed to appreciate her cooking, though he said little. When they'd finished, he insisted on helping with the dishes, despite Willa's protests that it was her job. "Always helped my mother with dishes growing up," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "Habit now." As they worked side by side, Willa washing, York drying, she felt an unexpected ease in his presence. For a man of few words, he somehow made silence comfortable rather than awkward. "Thank you again," she said as they finished. "Not just for the meal, but for offering me this position when I had nowhere else to turn." York set the last plate in the cupboard before answering. "Everyone needs help sometimes." He hesitated, then added, "Had my share of hard times. Know what it's like." With that simple statement, Willa felt she understood him a little better. He hadn't helped her out of charity or pity, but from a place of knowing what it meant to struggle and be shown kindness. "Well, good night then, Mr. York," she corrected herself with a small smile. "I'll have breakfast ready at sunrise." "Good night, Willa." He nodded and left the kitchen, his footsteps receding down the hall to his office. In her room that night, Willa unpacked her meager belongings and sat at the window, watching the stars emerge over the Nevada landscape. Her situation was not what she had planned when she'd left St. Louis, but perhaps it was where she needed to be. A temporary refuge, at least, until she could find her way again. She couldn't have known then, watching those stars, how deeply her life would become entwined with the quiet rancher who had placed his savings on a hotel counter for a woman he'd never met, or how this place would slowly work its way into her heart until she couldn't imagine being anywhere else. The first weeks at the Alderman ranch passed in a blur of hard work and new routines. Willa rose before dawn each day to prepare breakfast, learned the rhythms of ranch life, and gradually transformed the functional but impersonal house into something that felt more like a home. She added small touches: wildflowers in jars on the dining table, curtains she sewed from fabric purchased with her first wages, and bread baking in the oven that filled the house with its comforting aroma. York noticed these changes but said little, though she sometimes caught him looking at the flowers or taking an extra deep breath when he entered the kitchen to find fresh bread cooling. He was a man of routine and few words, but not unkind. In fact, Willa found him to be a fair and considerate employer who never raised his voice or made unreasonable demands. On Sundays, when she cooked for all the ranch hands, she got to know the men who worked for York. Pete, the young foreman, was always eager to help her carry heavy items or reach things from high shelves. There were brothers Tom and Samuel Parker, who had come from Missouri, Eduardo Vasquez from New Mexico, whose guitar playing after dinner became a Sunday tradition, Charlie Two Feathers, a Paiute man who was the best horseman on the ranch, and several others who came and went with the seasons. From them, she learned more about York than he had told her himself. How he had started with almost nothing and built the ranch through sheer determination and hard work. How he was respected in the county for his fair dealings and expert knowledge of cattle. How he never turned away anyone in need but had little patience for laziness or dishonesty. "Boss saved my life," Charlie told her one Sunday as he helped her wash dishes after dinner. "Found me half dead on the trail 3 winters back, blizzard coming in. Brought me here, gave me a job when I healed up. He seems to have a habit of rescuing people," Willa said with a small smile. Charlie's dark eyes were knowing. "Only the ones worth saving." As spring turned to summer, Willa found herself watching for York each evening, listening for his footsteps on the porch. Their conversations over meals had lengthened from brief exchanges to actual discussions. He asked about her life in St. Louis, about her father, about the books she read in her spare time. She learned about his childhood in Pennsylvania, his service in the Union Army, and his dreams for the ranch. One evening in July, after a particularly hot day, York returned later than usual. Willa had kept his dinner warm in the oven, and when he finally came in, his shirt was soaked with sweat and his face was drawn with fatigue. "Sit," she said, pulling out his chair. "I'll get you some water first, then food." He sank into the chair without argument, a sign of how tired he truly was. Willa poured a glass of cool water from the pitcher she kept in the icebox, then served his dinner: roast beef, potatoes, and green beans from her garden. "One of the wells is running dry," he said after drinking half the water in one long swallow. "Had to ride out to the north pasture and move the herd closer to the creek." "Will there be enough water if the drought continues?" Willow asked, concerned. She had learned enough about ranching by now to understand that water was life out here. "Should be. We're better off than most. I dug deeper wells when I first settled here." He looked at her. "This is good," he added, gesturing to the food. "Thank you for waiting up." "Of course." She hesitated, then sat down across from him with her own glass of water. It wasn't their usual routine. She typically left him to eat in peace, but something about his weariness made her reluctant to leave him alone. They sat in comfortable silence for a while as he ate. Willa noticed how the lamplight caught the silver strands beginning to appear at his temples, how his hands, strong and calloused from years of ranch work, still handled his utensils with unexpected grace. "I received a letter today," she said finally, "from the school board in Carson City. They're looking for a teacher for the fall term." York's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "You applying? I'm considering it. It's what I came west to do after all, to teach." He set down his fork, his expression unreadable. "Carson City's a good town, growing fast." "Yes, I've heard that." Willa studied her hands. "I haven't decided yet. I just thought you should know." York nodded slowly. "You'd make a fine teacher. Thank you." She stood and began clearing the dishes, not meeting his eyes. "I should let you finish your meal in peace. Good night, York." "Good night, Willa." As she climbed the stairs to her room, Willa wondered why the thought of leaving the ranch filled her with such melancholy. It had only been a temporary situation, after all a fortunate opportunity when she had needed it most. But somehow, in these few months, the Alderman ranch had begun to feel like home in a way no place had since her father's death. And York had become more than an employer. A friend, certainly, but there was something else, something in the way her heart quickened when he entered a room, in the way she found herself thinking of things to tell him throughout the day, in the way she sometimes caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. But he had never indicated any interest beyond friendship and respect, and Willa was not foolish enough to mistake kindness for affection. Her future lay in teaching. It was what she had trained for, what she had come west to do. The school in Carson City was an opportunity she would be foolish to dismiss. Yet as she lay in bed that night, listening to the cicadas sing in the darkness, Willa wondered if she was making the right choice, and why the thought of leaving York Alderman behind made her chest ache in a way she had never experienced before. The Carson City teaching position lingered in Willa's mind over the next few weeks. She drafted a letter of application but did not send it, telling herself she was waiting for more information about the position. In truth, she was conflicted in a way she hadn't anticipated when she'd first arrived at the ranch. August brought a heat wave that had everyone moving slower. The ranch hands started work before dawn to avoid the worst of the afternoon sun, and Willa adjusted her routines accordingly, baking bread in the early morning hours and preparing cold suppers that wouldn't require heating the kitchen more than necessary. One particularly stifling evening, York suggested they eat their supper on the porch where they might catch the faint breeze that sometimes stirred at sunset. Willa set a small table with cold chicken, potato salad, and sliced tomatoes from her garden, along with a pitcher of lemonade she'd made that morning. They ate in companionable silence for a time, watching as the sun sank toward the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Never get tired of that view," York remarked, his voice soft with appreciation. "It's beautiful," Willa agreed, taking a sip of her lemonade. "I've grown fond of this place." York glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "Does that mean you've decided not to take the teaching position?" Willa set down her glass. "I haven't decided yet. The term doesn't start for another month." He nodded, returning his gaze to the sunset. After a moment he said, "Ranch wouldn't be the same without you." The simple statement made Willa's heart flutter in her chest. It was the closest York had come to expressing that he valued her presence beyond her work. "I've been happy here," she admitted. "Happier than I expected to be." York turned to look at her fully, his gray eyes intent. "Then stay." "As your housekeeper?" The question slipped out before she could consider its implications. A flash of something uncertainty, hope, crossed York's usually stoic features. "If that's what you want." Willa looked down at her hands folded in her lap. "I don't know what I want anymore. I came west to teach, to be independent, but here I've found." She trailed off, unsure how to articulate the sense of belonging she'd discovered at the Alderman ranch. "Found what?" York prompted, his voice gentle. "A home," she said simply. "People who matter to me." The silence that followed was charged with unspoken emotions. When York finally spoke, his voice was lower, rougher than usual. "You matter to me too, Willa." "More than," he broke off as the sound of galloping hooves interrupted the moment. Pete came riding hard up the drive, pulling his horse to a sharp stop near the porch. "Boss, fire in the south pasture. Lightning strike from that storm brewing over the mountains." York was on his feet instantly. "How bad?" "Moving fast with the wind. Eduardo and Charlie are trying to hold it back, but we need more hands." "I'll saddle up. You ride to the Hamilton place, see if they can send help." York turned to Willa. "Stay here. If the wind shifts and brings the fire this way, take what you can and ride to town. Rusty will go with you." Before she could respond, he was striding toward the barn, his tall figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. Willa stood on the porch, watching as he and Pete rode out minutes later, heading toward the ominous glow now visible on the southern horizon. The night that followed was one of the longest of Willa's life. She packed essentials, money, documents, a change of clothes in case evacuation became necessary, then prepared food and coffee for the men who would return exhausted if they managed to contain the blaze. She filled water barrels and soaked blankets to place against the house if needed. Through it all, she watched the southern sky, where the orange glow seemed to grow despite the men's efforts. Occasionally, riders would appear, ranch hands coming for more water, for food, or to exchange spent horses for fresh ones. Each brought news. The fire was spreading but slowing. Neighboring ranchers had arrived to help. York was leading efforts to create a firebreak by burning a controlled line ahead of the main blaze. It was nearly dawn when York finally returned, his face blackened with soot, his clothes smelling of smoke and sweat. He stumbled slightly as he climbed the porch steps, and Willa was at his side instantly, supporting him with an arm around his waist. "It's contained," he said, his voice hoarse from smoke and shouting. "Lost some grazing land and part of the south fence, but the cattle are safe. No one hurt." "Thank God," Willa breathed, helping him to a chair. "Sit. I'll bring water and food." She returned moments later with a basin of clean water, cloths, and a plate of food. York had leaned his head back against the chair, his eyes closed, utterly spent. Willa set down her burdens and gently began to clean the soot from his face with a damp cloth. York's eyes opened at her touch, watching her face as she worked. Neither spoke as she tenderly wiped away the grime, her fingers occasionally brushing against his skin in a way that sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with the summer heat. When his face was clean, she handed him a glass of water which he drank gratefully. "The others," she asked, coming in shifts, told them to get food and rest, then relieve the men still watching the fire line. "You should rest too, you've been up all night." He nodded, exhaustion evident in every line of his body, but made no move to rise. "Thought we might lose it all," he said quietly. "Kept thinking about you here alone if the wind had shifted." "I wasn't afraid," Willa said, though it wasn't entirely true. "I knew you'd come back if there was real danger." York reached out then, taking her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, warm against her skin. "Willa," he began, then seemed to lose the words he'd been about to say. She waited, her heart pounding, but whatever moment might have been building between them was interrupted by the arrival of more riders, the next shift of men coming for food and fresh horses, before returning to watch the fire line. York released her hand and stood, once more the capable ranch owner rather than the vulnerable man of moments before. "I'll help them with the horses," "Then get some rest," he said. "Thank you, Willa." She watched him walk toward the barn, straight-backed despite his exhaustion, and wondered what he had been about to say and whether the moment, like the fire, had been contained but not extinguished. In the days that followed the fire, life at the ranch returned to its normal rhythms, but something had shifted between York and Willa. There was a new awareness in their interactions, a careful consideration in their words and glances. The teaching position in Carson City remained unmentioned, though the deadline for application was approaching. One afternoon, Willa was in the kitchen garden, harvesting late summer vegetables, when York appeared at the garden gate. He had been out since early morning, assessing the damage to the south pasture and supervising the rebuilding of the fence line. "Need some help?" he offered, opening the gate. Willa smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face with the back of her hand. "I wouldn't turn it down. These beans are particularly abundant this year." York removed his hat, hanging it on the garden fence post, and joined her among the plants. His hands, so large and work-roughened, were surprisingly gentle as he picked beans and placed them in her basket. They worked in companionable silence for a time, the only sounds the buzzing of bees among the flowering herbs and the distant lowing of cattle. "I've been thinking," York said finally, straightening to his full height, "about what you said before the fire, about finding a home here." Willa's hand stilled on the bean plants. "Yes, I don't want you to stay as my housekeeper." His voice was firm but gentle. A cold feeling settled in Willa's stomach. Had she misread everything? Was he dismissing her? "I see," she said carefully, not meeting his eyes. "I understand if you need to make changes." "No," York interrupted, stepping closer. "That's not what I meant. I don't want you to stay as my housekeeper because I want you to stay as my wife." Willa's head jerked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Your wife?" York's normally composed expression was open, vulnerable, his gray eyes intense as they held hers. "I'm not good with words, Willa, never have been. But I know what I feel. When you came here, this place was just somewhere I lived. Now it's a home, because of you." He took another step toward her, close enough now that she could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes, smell the clean scent of soap and sunshine that clung to him. "I love you," he said simply. "Have for a while now. Thought about telling you 100 times, but was afraid you'd choose teaching instead. Then that fire came, and I realized life's too short not to speak your heart." Willa stood frozen, the basket of beans forgotten at her feet. She had dreamed of this moment, had imagined York confessing feelings for her, but now that it was happening, she found herself speechless with emotion. York's confidence seemed to waver at her silence. "I understand if you don't feel the same. You came west to teach, not to marry a rancher. I won't stand in your way if that's still what you want." "York," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper, "the reason I haven't sent my application to Carson City is because I couldn't bear the thought of leaving you." Hope bloomed in his eyes. "Does that mean, I love you too?" she said, the words rushing out now that she had begun. "I think I have almost since that day at the hotel when you placed your savings on the counter for a woman you'd never met." The smile that transformed York's face was like the sun breaking through clouds, rare and brilliant. He closed the distance between them in one stride, his hands coming up to cradle her face with infinite tenderness. "Willa Callaghan," he said softly, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she whispered, tears of happiness filling her eyes. "Yes, York Alderman, I will marry you." His kiss was gentle at first, almost reverent, but deepened as Willa's arms wound around his neck, drawing him closer. In the warmth of the garden, surrounded by the fruits of their shared labor, they sealed their promise to each other, a promise born from kindness in a moment of need. nurtured through months of growing respect and affection, and now blossoming into love. When they finally drew apart, both breathless, York kept her close in the circle of his arms. "When?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Soon," Willa said, smiling up at him. "I don't want to wait." "Neither do I." He brushed a kiss against her forehead. "We could ride into town tomorrow, speak to the preacher. 2 weeks should be enough time to prepare." 2 weeks, she agreed, her heart so full it felt it might burst. "Though I don't need anything fancy, just you and this place we've made a home." York's eyes were tender as he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You'll have both, Willa, for as long as we live." In that moment, standing in the garden with the man she loved, Willa thought of how close she had come to never knowing this happiness, how a missed teaching position and empty pockets had led her to the very place she was meant to be. If those men hadn't laughed when she couldn't pay her debt, York might never have stepped forward. If he hadn't placed his savings on that hotel counter, their paths might never have crossed. Sometimes, she reflected, what seems like misfortune is merely the first step on the path to where you truly belong. News of their engagement spread quickly through the ranch, and then to the town of Willow Creek. Reactions were uniformly positive. The ranch hands clapped York on the back and told Willa they'd known all along he was sweet on her, while townspeople expressed their delight that the confirmed bachelor had finally found a match. Mrs. Holcomb from the hotel, upon hearing the news when York and Willa visited town to speak with the preacher, actually smiled. "Well now, isn't that something? I always said that girl had pluck. And you, York Alderman, who knew you had such romance in you." York, uncomfortable with the attention, merely nodded and escorted Willa to their next errand, but she caught the hint of pride in his expression as people congratulated them. The wedding preparations were simple but meaningful. Willa purchased fabric for a new dress, not white, which seemed impractical for a ranch wedding, but a soft blue that matched her eyes. The ranch hands, led by an enthusiastic Pete, insisted on building an arbor where the ceremony would take place, positioning it so that the majestic mountain view would form the backdrop. 2 days before the wedding, a stagecoach arrived at the ranch carrying an unexpected visitor, Mrs. Eleanor Donovan, the former housekeeper who had left to marry a shopkeeper in Carson City. "Couldn't miss York's wedding," she declared, embracing a surprised Willa warmly. "Not after all the years I spent telling that man he needed a wife." Eleanor proved to be a godsend, helping with last-minute preparations and sharing stories about York that made Willa laugh and love him even more, like how he had once stayed up all night with a sick calf, reading aloud to it from a book of poetry to keep himself awake. "He's a good man," Eleanor told Willa the night before the wedding as they sat on the porch enjoying the cool evening air. "Best I ever worked for, but lonely. Too stubborn to admit it, but I saw it. Not anymore, though." She patted Willa's hand. "You've brought light back to this place." The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, the September air crisp with the first hint of autumn. Willa dressed in her blue gown, and Eleanor arranged wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. When she emerged from the house to walk to the arbor where York and the preacher waited, a hush fell over the assembled guests, ranch hands, neighbors, and townspeople who had come to witness the union. York, standing tall in a new black suit, turned as she approached. The naked adoration in his eyes as he watched her walk toward him made Willa's heart swell with joy. This man, this strong, quiet, honorable man, loved her, and she loved him with every fiber of her being. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. They exchanged simple vows and rings. York had ridden all the way to Carson City to find a delicate gold band for Willa, while she had secretly purchased a wider band for him from the same jeweler, with Eleanor's help. I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher declared. "York, you may kiss your bride." As York's lips met hers in a tender kiss, sealing their vows, cheers erupted from the gathering. Rusty barked excitedly, and someone, probably Eduardo, began playing a joyful tune on his guitar. The celebration that followed was everything a ranch wedding should be: abundant food spread on long tables under the trees, music and dancing that continued well into the evening, and an atmosphere of genuine goodwill and happiness. As sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues, York found Willa sitting for a moment of quiet at the edge of the festivities. He sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "Happy?" he asked, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Completely," she answered, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Are you? More than I ever thought possible." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Mrs. Alderman." The name sent a pleasant shiver through Willa. "It has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Willa Alderman, the very best." His arm tightened around her. "Thank you for what? For staying. For loving me. For making this place a real home." Willa turned her face up to his, her eyes shining with love and promise. "Thank you for placing your savings on that counter, for giving me a chance when I needed it most." Their kiss was a renewal of the vows they had spoken hours before, a promise of partnership, of love, of a future built together on the foundation of trust and respect they had established in the months since that fateful day at the Willow Creek Hotel. Later, after the guests had departed and the ranch had grown quiet under the blanket of stars, York carried Willa across the threshold of the house that was now truly theirs together. Their coming together as husband and wife was a tender culmination of the love that had grown between them, gentle yet passionate, built on the deep understanding they had developed during their months of living and working side by side. In the quiet aftermath, lying in York's arms, Willa marveled at the journey that had brought her to this place, this man, this life that was so different from what she had planned, yet so perfectly right. "Penny for your thoughts," York murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "I was just thinking about fate," she replied, nestling closer to his warmth. "How the worst moment of my life led me to the best," he nodded, understanding immediately. "That day at the hotel. If those men hadn't laughed when I couldn't pay my debt, if I hadn't been there to hear them." Willa raised herself on one elbow to look into his eyes. "Why did you help me? You never did tell me what made you step forward that day." York was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "My mother," he said finally. "When I was a boy, we fell on hard times after my father died. There was a day she couldn't pay for food at the general store. Men laughed. But someone helped a stranger passing through town. Never forgot how it felt, watching her humiliation turn to relief." His hand came up to caress Willa's cheek. "When I saw you there, so proud despite everything, couldn't stand by and do nothing." Willa turned her face to press a kiss into his palm. "Then I have your mother to thank as well, for raising such a good man." "And I have those laughing fools to thank," York said with a small smile, "for giving me the chance to meet the woman who would become my wife." Life as Mrs. Alderman was everything Willa could have hoped for and more. The transition from housekeeper to wife was seamless in some ways. She still managed the household, cooked meals, and tended the garden, but profoundly different in others. Now she was a true partner in the ranch, her opinions sought and valued, her presence a constant source of support and comfort for York. As autumn faded into winter, they settled into the rhythms of married life. York taught Willa to ride properly, not side saddle as she had learned in St. Louis, but astride, the way ranch women rode out west. Soon she was accompanying him on his rounds of the property, learning about cattle raising and the complex business of managing a successful ranch. At night, They would sit before the fire in the parlor York reading the newspaper or ranch accounts, Willa often with mending or a book in her lap. Sometimes they simply talked, sharing thoughts and dreams they had never voiced to another soul. In those quiet moments, their bond deepened beyond the physical attraction that had first drawn them together, forming a partnership of mind and spirit that complemented their love. Winter in Nevada could be harsh, with bitter cold and occasional blizzards that isolated the ranch for days at a time. During one such storm in January, as snow piled high against the windows and wind howled around the eaves, Willa and York lay wrapped in blankets before the parlor fire, the rest of the house closed off to conserve heat. "I never imagined winter could be so beautiful," Willa said, watching the dance of flames, even in its harshness. York's hand absently stroked her hair as she rested against his chest. "Beauty and harshness, that's Nevada for you. It's us too, isn't it?" she mused. "Both of us came through difficult times, found each other because of them." He made a sound of agreement, his chest rumbling pleasantly beneath her cheek. After a moment of comfortable silence, he asked, "Do you ever regret it? Not teaching?" Willa considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I miss the idea of it," she admitted, "but not enough to trade what I have now." She shifted to look up at him. "Actually, I've been thinking about that. There are children on neighboring ranches who can't get to the town school, especially in winter. I thought perhaps I could teach them here a few days a week." York's expression brightened. "You could use the old cabin. We could fix it up as a schoolroom." "Would you mind?" "Mind, Willa, it's perfect. Using your training, helping neighbors, but still here at the ranch." His arms tightened around her. "You're remarkable, you know that," she smiled, touched by his enthusiasm. "So you'll help me convince the neighboring families." "Won't take much convincing. Hamilton's been complaining for years about his young ones going without proper schooling in winter." As they lay there planning what would become the Alderman Ranch School, Willa felt a profound contentment. She had found a way to honor her original purpose in coming west while embracing the unexpected life she had built with York. Spring brought renewal to the land, and a surprise for the Aldermans. What Willa had at first attributed to a winter illness turned out to be the early signs of pregnancy. When the doctor from Willow Creek confirmed her suspicions, she could hardly wait for York to return from the north pasture to share the news. She met him at the corral as he rode in, her face glowing with excitement. One look at her expression, and York knew something significant had happened. "What is it?" he asked, swinging down from his horse. "We're going to have a baby," Willa said, her voice trembling with joy. "In autumn, the doctor thinks." York stood motionless for a heartbeat, processing her words. Then a slow smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes and lighting them with wonder. In 2 strides he reached her, lifting her off her feet in a gentle embrace. "A baby," he repeated, his voice rough with emotion. "Our baby." The months of Willa's pregnancy passed with York showing a protectiveness that was both touching and occasionally amusing. He insisted on hiring a young woman from town, Jenny Miller, to help with household tasks, despite Willa's protests that she was perfectly capable. "Doctor said you need rest," York said firmly. "And I need peace of mind." Willa conceded, finding that having help did allow her more time to prepare for the baby and to continue teaching the small group of ranch children who now came to the converted cabin 3 times a week for lessons. The Alderman Ranch School had been an immediate success, with 6 children from neighboring properties attending regularly. Willa found fulfillment in teaching while still maintaining her role as York's wife and partner in the ranch. It was, she often reflected, the perfect balance, a compromise that didn't feel like one. On a crisp October day, almost exactly a year after their wedding, Willa gave birth to a son after a long but uncomplicated labor. York, who had paced outside for hours, deaf to the reassurances of the midwife and Alina Donovan, who had returned for the birth, was finally allowed in to see his wife and child. The look on his face when he first beheld his son in Willa's arms was one she would remember for the rest of her life: awe, love, and a vulnerability he rarely showed to anyone but her. "He's perfect," York whispered, gently touching the baby's tiny hand, "just like his mother." They named him James, after Willa's father, with Michael as a middle name to honor York's father. James Michael Alderman had his mother's blue eyes and a hint of his father's strong jawline, even as a newborn. Life with a baby brought new challenges and joys. York proved to be a devoted father, often carrying James with him around the ranch in a sling the Paiute women had shown him how to use, talking to the infant about cattle and horses and the land that would someday be his. Willa's heart swelled each time she saw them together, her strong, serious husband speaking softly to their son about the changing seasons, the night sky, the importance of honor and hard work. In those moments, she knew with absolute certainty that all the twists and turns of fate that had brought her to Willow Creek had been leading her home. As James grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. York's careful management and innovative practices had made the Alderman spread one of the most successful in the county. They were able to hire more hands, improve the property, and even set aside savings for James's education and future. On James's second birthday, as family and neighbors gathered to celebrate, Willa shared more happy news with York: another baby was on the way. Their daughter, Elizabeth Alina Alderman, was born the following spring, completing their family circle. With 2 small children and the ranch school now expanded to accommodate 10 students, Willa's days were full and rich. There were challenges, of course: drought years when the cattle suffered, injuries and illnesses that brought worry, the constant work that ranch life demanded. But through it all, the partnership she and York had forged remained strong, their love deepening with each passing season. 5 years after Willa had stepped off the stagecoach in Willow Creek with empty pockets and dwindling hopes, she stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching York teaching 4-year-old James to ride his first pony while Elizabeth, now 2, clapped her hands in delight from her perch on Willa's hip. The setting sun gilded the scene, turning ordinary moments into a tableau of everything she had never known she wanted until it was hers. Her husband, strong and steady, guiding their son with patience and pride. Their daughter, a perfect blend of both parents, secure in the knowledge that she was deeply loved. The home they had built together, not just the physical structure but the life within it, a life of purpose, respect, and abiding love. "Mama, look," James called as he successfully guided his pony in a small circle, York walking alongside with a guiding hand near but not touching, letting the boy feel his own accomplishment. "I see you, sweetheart. Well done," Willa called back, her heart full to bursting. Later, with the children tucked into bed and the ranch quiet under a canopy of stars, York and Willa sat on the porch swing, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him in the familiar posture they had adopted over the years. "Happy?" York asked, echoing the question he had asked on their wedding day. "More than I ever dreamed possible," Willa answered truthfully. "You, beyond words." His fingers traced lazy patterns on her shoulder. "Sometimes I can hardly believe it, all this from that day at the hotel." Willa smiled, remembering. "They laughed when I couldn't pay my debt," she mused. "And you placed your savings on the counter." "Best investment I ever made," York said, pressing a kiss to her temple. In the years that followed, the story would become a family legend: how a moment of kindness had led to a lifetime of love. James and Elizabeth would grow up hearing how their parents met, how fate and good hearts had brought them together despite unlikely circumstances. The Alderman Ranch would continue to thrive, becoming known throughout the region for its prosperity, the quality of its stock, and the strength of the family at its heart. James would eventually take over its management, with Elizabeth becoming a teacher at the school her mother had founded, which by then had grown into a proper building serving children from miles around. And on quiet evenings, even as they grew old together, York and Willa would still sometimes sit on that porch swing, watching the sunset over the land they loved, marveling at the journey that had brought them to each other, a journey that began with laughter at a woman's misfortune, and a cowboy who placed his savings on a counter to help a stranger in need. In the tapestry of their lives together, that single act of kindness had been the first thread, bright and strong, from which all the rest had been woven into a pattern more beautiful than either could have imagined alone.